And I move on to part 3 of my essay, which I am putting here, and I hope you can see that. It says sympathy brackets question mark. We talked about this with Percy Shelley. You don't need to feel sympathetic for Percy Shelley if you don't want to. There were lots of things that Percy Shelley did in his life that would encourage one to not feel very sympathetic about him or towards him at all. For example, running off from his pregnant wife to go and run off with Mary Godwin at the time, soon to become Mary Shelley, and then his wife dying. You know the biographical background and how Shelley did not always behave in a wonderful way that we would look back and go, oh, poor guy. Okay. However, that doesn't stop us from understanding that it is possible to interpret the literature in a way which does invite sympathy. And of course, that's because that is what Percy Shelley wants us to feel. So of course, as a natural response to the language he has used, you don't have to emotionally feel this, but on an academic level, you can say, well, there are designs going on in the literature here which are inviting us to feel sympathetic for him. We could argue, as we have done before, that the balance of power could be construed as being tipping the other way. Why? Because if he is having to put up this big rhetorical argument to win over the object of his desire in the first place, that suggests that she is resisting him, and he ends up feeling rather helpless. We don't get some kind of resolution here where he does achieve getting the girl of his dreams, whoever she is. We don't get that. What we get is the petulant voice of a child. Why not I with thine? The monosyllabic simple language sounds like a little boy, right? Little schoolboy. You can imagine him in his little shorts, hands in his pockets. Why can't I have the thing that I want? Kicking the ground with his scuffed shoes. The tone of the lines could be read as slightly petulant. What are all these kissings worth if thou not kiss me, or if thou kiss not me? That's the end of the poem, and that is the high point. It's the climax of his angsty sort of young man. I'm sort of depressed because I feel unloved and I feel unappreciated, and I have this unrequited love. Okay, that's the expression there. In The Farmer's Bride, are we led at all to feel any sympathy for this character? Well, I think that it's a given that Charlotte Mew, and you can talk about her writing generally, and the fact that she's got a very feminist stance. She has biographical details about her life as well as her art, which are driving this in only one direction, which is she is wanting to stand up for women and expose the plight of women by creating narratives which show us what it's like to be a woman in this, and basically you're living in a nightmare. Okay, so we know the design is not for us to feel sympathetic, and yet because she writes from the perspective of the male person, we are invited at times to somehow understand how this guy is thinking. We don't need to emotionally agree with him, but we can see how the literature is helping us to agree with him. One of his biggest desires one of his first desires is sex, okay? And it's kind of hidden, but it's hidden in here, line 4 to 5. When us was wed, she turned afraid of love and me and all things human. I think it's very easy to read the triplet of she turned afraid of love and me and all things human, particularly, all those 3 things in a row are suggesting that he's trying to sleep with her, and this is something that is frankly to her, it's just terrifying. It's completely scary, right? And so the character of the farmer is obviously very upset by this, doesn't really understand it, maybe feeling a bit hurt. We're invited to see kind of through what the farmer is seeing. And there is an element that you could say, you all know what dramatic irony is when the audience knows more, really knows what's going on here beyond the farmer. You can hear the farmer's voice saying, what's so bad about me? And all of us reading the poem go, well, we can see what's so horrendous about you, the language you use, the way that you're treating this person, it's really, really horrible, okay? I think it's very important there to look at the fact that line 5, where it follows on from line 4, when us was wed, she turned afraid. I think this is a direct reference to the fact that, it's no sex before marriage, it's the wedding ceremony, and then at that point, there would traditionally be the consummation of the marriage, and this is the moment where the bride becomes afraid of him. So it's signalling that, I think that's what Charlotte Mew is doing in lines 4 and 5. It's signalling that that's what this is about. Later, he's expressing his desire not only to sleep with her, but also that he wants a child. That's later in the poem, line 40. What's Christmas time without there be some other in the house than we? Okay, he's talking about a child. It's linked to Christmas time, birth of a child, right? Miraculous stuff, okay? And he's very sad and lonely. And his loneliness is then expressed in the end of the poem with that thing about, there's a stair betwixt us. That's not just a physical, they're sleeping in different rooms. That's also a symbolic thing about, she is up there, right? Well, what kind of references can you interpret from her being placed up higher than him? Is that status? Is it power? Is it some kind of heavenly thing, which is to do with, the symbolic place of where she is? Is it the physical separation, which is a metaphor for their emotional separation? Well, that's absolutely true, okay? So, do we get some sympathy here? Well, we at least understand how he feels. Said already, he's a simple-minded guy, and again, that simplistic monosyllabic expression at the end there. You can also bring in AO 3 points. I don't think it's unreasonable at all I think it's unreasonable to tar working-class people, rural people, with a huge brush saying, they're all one type of person. I think it is reasonable in this poem for us to understand that this is a farmer who is a simple-minded person, whose language is not sophisticated. It's very heavily suggestive of him being an uneducated, overbearing, boorish person. You cannot fathom what he's done wrong. So he is lonely and she is lonely as well. And if we were looking at through this sort of a 2020 perspective sort of lens, there would be something additional interesting to say there about how when we talk about, what these days we refer to as toxic masculinity, the whole toxic masculinity argument, which actually says the patriarchy doesn't just hurt women. Standards of masculinity, masculine behaviour that's been passed down for centuries, doesn't just have a negative effect on women. It also has a negative effect on men. And it's possible to say that without saying, oh, poor the farmer, we're going to cry for him instead of her. But it does say something about how we highlight the tragedy here, the tragedy of two people who are both as lonely and miserable as each other, because there are these structures in society. It's called marriage. It's called a man chooses a woman then is the property of the man. She doesn't have any rights. She can't vote. She can't own a house. She can't have a bank account. She's not going to have any control. She's not going to do any work. That is a structure which, if you thought that was a good thing, if you were, a masculinist, that's a word I just made up, but if you were on the side of masculinity, then you suddenly go, oh, this actually isn't working for the farmer here. Charlotte Mew's point, it's not just men are terrible, hashtag men are really, really awful, but actually a patriarchal society, a sexist, misogynistic, male-dominated society is bad for everybody. And I think that's kind of another way that you can take this poem, which it is not the only way to read it, but it kind of is in there. Okay, I think I've spoken enough today. Some ideas there, some ways for you to think, and if you don't take any of these ideas about these two poems or want to compare them, what I want you to take away is the ideas about how you compare these two poems across with each other through using a 3-point line of argument plan like this. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope that was helpful. And do, if you've got anything to say or things that you want to ask, you can leave them in the comments, or of course, you can get in touch. Well done, everyone, and thank you again. Goodbye.